Hi, I'm Ben Stiller, and you're listening to the Pantheon Network.
Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 3 of Music is Not a Genre. Lifting my hands up to gesture MxG. A little slower now, so I can, kind of delineate it a little bit more, be a little bit more distinctive, which I'm sure you listeners will really appreciate. Thank you, as always, by the way, for listening and watching. You listeners, if you want to see those lovely hand gestures, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, yes, again, you see the shirt. Partly because I'm recording this the same day, but also because I promised you last week I would tell you why I'm wearing this shirt for the 2010s. And you're going to find out this episode. But if you'd rather not stare at it while you're finding out and you just want to listen, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre. You can stream this podcast everywhere. And, of course, patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast. And I'll make the same joke for as little as $1 a month or as much as $50,000 a month. And I know you're out there. So this week's topic, what's an album and why? Part 7.2, the 2010s. Huh? What? And that sound is represented in the graphic or in the text by 10 question marks for 2010s. I started as a placeholder for me because I just couldn't come up with a great title for this. And then I realized that is the title because the second half of the 2010s make the first half of the 2010s seem like the 2000s, if that makes any sense. They're as confusing as that sentence. That's what I'll say. But before we get there, of course, let me tell you a little bit about my new sponsor, Qobuz, Qobuz. Originated in France. It's a music platform launched in 2007. It offers high-res streaming and downloading of over 100 million tracks. I don't know how that compares to the number of tracks on Spotify or Apple, but I believe it's a pretty damn high number, and you're going to find a lot there. Along with the music on Qobuz, you can find editorial content, liner notes, interviews, more, which I like because I have that sense of wanting to have more than just the music with me when I am absorbing music. And later on in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about how the physical presence of something that represents music actually has an impact on how we consume that music, how it impacts us, how we absorb it. And I'll go into a little bit that later. But Qobuz does a fair job at replicating that with all that extra content along with the high-res files. It takes a boutique record shop approach to music. All right. It's on iOS and Android, so go look it up. It's about the same price as Spotify or Apple Music. So why the subtitle? Again, the continued fracturing in and out of the music world was creating more diversity than ever, yet the most popular music was becoming increasingly homogenized. So really confusing. A lot of question marks there. So much good comes from stuff being put into the hands of the creators and allowing them to release stuff to the world with no middleman. A lot of good comes. We just get a chance for people to hear the music. But lack of representation in the higher echelons means less accountability to those indie artists who suffer in the trenches, who are making a much lesser share of the overall profits than they would have in previous decades. It leaves a very, very select few artists and companies dominate the landscape, the Taylor Swifts and the Drakes, let's say, at the expense of developing many more artists. So, a lot of us have to self-develop, essentially. I know I've worked with some producers and some other, et cetera. But in general, there's not a company or a team of people directing you or helping you or guiding you or suggesting things to you. Certainly not anybody promoting you and putting money behind you for things like that. So there's good and bad to this fracturing. There's good and bad to being self-reliant, which is, again, why you'll see the number of debut albums by year decrease dramatically in the second half of the 2010s, although it wouldn't get to its low point until the 2020s so far. At the same time, artists themselves were trying to figure out what it even meant to make an album, quote unquote, and if it was even worth it. At this point in the development of the album, which, by the way, the final episode of this, which is coming up, I don't think next week. I don't know. Might be next week. It might be a few weeks from now. The final in this series, What's an Album and Why, is going to go over kind of the overview of how the album has changed over the decades. So I will definitely get to that. And part of that change was, well, if singles are the thing that rule the day in streaming, and it wasn't the first time singles ruled the day in history, but it was pretty significant, then what do you do with an album? And we'll get into a little bit of that later on. Which, by the way, that ties to the bonus MxG video on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. The bonus this week is part 2 of last week's on about how the crossover affected musicians, crossover from physical to digital sales. And this part 2 is on the decrease in artists' revenue, why it happened, how it happened, when it happened, and how businesses, artists, and fans can reconcile this and all be okay with it, because we all have to figure this out. It's not just artists fighting for their rights or fans fighting for access or fighting on behalf of artists or whatever or maybe fighting on behalf of the businesses, if that's your flavor, or businesses fighting for a greater and greater share or whatever it is. It's all of us have to figure this out. Okay. So yeah, I could put this twice. Episode rundown. Again, as always, I'll go year by year. I'm going to go from 2015 to 2019. So the final 5 years of the decade. Doing an overview first, top of the charts for the year, notable debuts and other notable releases. I'll then do some conclusions for both the second half of the 2010s and the entire decade. Really a featured song, as always, from Rec this week, and questions, which I'd love to hear from you about those, about anything, really. Sources, again, Wikipedia, Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Rate Your Music, and Digital Dream Door. And my same disclaimer, you're not going to hear every damn thing that was released in every year. That's insane. I'm already insane, and I don't like showing how much more insane I can be. You kind of got to pay for that. And so I'll miss things. And a lot of that missing is deliberate. Somebody, I don't ignore artists who have made an impact on the world, even if I don't like them, because that's not fair. And that kind of goes to the first episode of this season. Like, understand your own preferences, but don't think your preferences are the final judgment on anything. At the same time, there are artists I'm not going to mention because I don't know if they made that much of an impact, or I might have just missed them. So that's my disclaimer. Let's get into 2015. The continued fracturing, as I mentioned. Still in an interesting period of diversity everywhere, under the charts, on the charts, etc. But you can start to feel the mellow bland creeping in. You can start to feel what has happened in the last, not quite, I would say 10 years, maybe. And it is changing now. It's changed in the last 2 years. Not completely, but it's getting there. And that is that there has grown in more than one genre a sameness in production and a sameness in the level of expression in music, which I talked about a couple of years ago in an episode about how the 2020s were like the 1970s, where things just got so mellow. And I talked to somebody who's a little younger than I am, who was saying the same thing, like the reason why she doesn't listen to a lot of new music is because it's too mellow for her. And it's funny to think that historically that's usually the opposite, where the older people will say your music is too loud. And it's the opposite that's happening now. And even though I do listen to a fair deal of new music, a lot of it has been disappointing to me because it lacks teeth, or it thinks it has teeth, but it's like false teeth. I don't know. That's my metaphor for the week. Ding dong, metaphor for the week. So anyway, 2015, a lot less country than in previous years. As I mentioned, that would happen in the second half of the 2010s, and a lot more pop and a lot more hip hop. Really, hip hop was just so dominant, but pop, just general pop music too. And a real surge of, non-American music being released in America. We saw it trickling in the early 2010s. It started to go crazy in the late 2010s, and it's pretty much the world we live in now in many ways. And a lot of it's the same internet stars taking over the charts, which happened so little in the 2000s and not super amount in the 2010s. TV stars from, shows, contest shows, whatever, America's Got Talent and all that crap, did make big impacts in the 2000s. So it was sort of the quote-unquote amateurs becoming, and not to say that means that they were worse in quality-wise or whatever, it's pretty much the same mix. But people who hadn't devoted their full career to anything in the same way, that's what the internet served. Although now, in a lot of cases, people do devote their whole career from either, side of that, either if you're a TV, contestant or just releasing online, like me. Top albums for 2015. The Fast and Furious 7 soundtrack, The Descendants soundtrack, the Pitch Perfect 2 soundtrack, Empire, the TV show original soundtrack, season 1. Drake, again, at number 1. Future, Drake with Future, had a separate album at number 1. Kendrick, To Pimp a Butterfly, what a great album. Big Sean, A$AP Rocky, again, Fetty Wap's debut, Whale, Meek Mill, Tyrese, Jill Scott. I had no idea Jill Scott had that many number 1 albums after the very early 2000s, but she had like 3 or 4. Janet Jackson, another number 1. James Taylor, so some throwback artists. Luke Bryan, Chris Stapleton's debut. Zac Brown Band again. Alabama Shakes again. Disturbed and Muse and Fall Out Boy. Imagine Dragons, 21 Pilots. Florence and the Machine. Breaking Benjamin, which I could never have told you what era Breaking Benjamin was from. It's weird. 5 Seconds of Summer, again. Mumford & Sons, again. The Weeknd. Pentatonix, first number 1 album. Justin Bieber, again. Shawn Mendes' debut, number 1. Kelly Clarkson, which I think she had been out of number 1 for a while at that point. Selena Gomez, again, number 1. Meghan Trainor's debut. Adele's 25 made her debut, so the number 1. And Taylor Swift's 1989 was the big winner for the year. Released the previous year, dominated the charts in 2015. Unusual that Taylor Swift dominated the charts. Debuts. Notable debuts for 2015, quite a bit fewer, but still in the mid-300s, still a healthy amount being released by these labels. Fifth Harmony, Sabrina Carpenter, Tori Kelly, Elle King, Halsey, a lot of pop, a lot of singers, a lot of female singers. Andra Day, Courtney Barnett, Wolf Alice, saw them in concert just a couple years after this, actually. They were really great. Nathaniel Ratliff and the Night Sweats. I think it might be Ratliff. I don't know. Leon Bridges, 2015. Kruang Bin, Vince Staples, Ty Dolla $ign, Travis Scott, and Lil Sims, British hip-hop artist. She's great. All debuted in 2015. Notable releases as well. Not a ton here either, but some good ones. Beach House, Tame Impala, still going strong, as well as Kurt Vile. Another great album from Bjork, and another one from Madonna. Carly Rae Jepsen released a great album that year. It was the one that no one bought because it was a couple years after Call Me Maybe, and I guess everyone thought of her as a one-hit wonder even before she had a chance to establish herself. But everywhere else, including in her own career, she's very well established and very well respected. Earl Sweatshirt released another interesting album. Little Ugly Mane. Ray Shremmerd released a great album. And also, by the way, Wreck, my band, in 2015 released the album The Sunshine Seminar, which is some people's favorite Wreck album still, which I love. I don't care what your favorite is. It's wonderful that you're listening to it at all. The featured song in this episode is from Wreck's album, The Sunshine Seminar. What's wonderful about that album is that I think there are a couple other Wreck albums that are also almost as easy to search for, but you can search for Wreck, R-E-C, The Sunshine Seminar, and it pretty much the first thing or second thing that pops up no matter where you search for it. 2016, tough year for music, and not the last tough year, but really a year that hit us all hard. So many deaths. Bowie, Prince, Leonard Cohen, George Michael all die in 2016, as well as George Martin, Phife Dawg, Emerson and Lake, Leon Russell, Glenn Fry, Merle Haggard. Tough year. A lot of big music stars dead. But in my estimation, a much better music year than 2015. Or if not better, at least more interesting, I will say that. It's also the year Lemonade lost out to Adele. I mean, it was the year they were both released. But as far as when that happened, it would have been the following year's Grammys. But you get it. Top albums for 2016, the Hamilton mixtape, artists doing songs from Hamilton. Jeezy, Drake, again, Kendrick, again, Kanye, again, Future, again, J. Cole, Travis Scott. So many repeats, number one. A lot of people on a roll. Tribe Called Quest's final album. DJ Khaled. Suicide Squad soundtrack. Bon Jovi, Metallica, Green Day, Blink-182, The 1975, Panic at the Disco, David Bowie's Black Star, the last album, Kings of Leon, The Lumineers. So wait a second. I said last week that one of those years was the last big year for rock, and I was wrong. It might have been 2016, and maybe by the end of this episode I'll be wrong about that too, but this was a pretty damn big year for rock. Crazy to think in 2016 rock still had such a presence. And again, I'm not saying this because I think rock is better than other genres. I love many genres as much as rock. But I'm saying it to you people who think that the state of the music industry is gauged only by how big or little a presence rock has anywhere. So stop complaining, basically. Also, top that year, Jason Aldean again, Shawn Mendes again, Zayn from One Direction, debut, number one, Frank Ocean again, Prince's Best of course, went to number one. The Weeknd, again, Rihanna, as I mentioned, Beyonce's Lemonade, Solange had a number one album, Lady Gaga, Gwen Stefani, also number one, Barbra Streisand, number one album again, but the winner of the year, Adele's 25, the biggest album of the year. Some great debuts, huge drop in the number of debut albums. The industry at this point in 2016 was already suffering so much. It had hit the low point in sales in 2014 and was still reeling and didn't really know where things were going. So they had to pull back, and there were well under 300 debut releases from major labels. And for the first time since maybe the 1980s, you're seeing a huge difference in this year between what was on the charts and what was happening underground, meaning there was a shift happening that would affect the subsequent years. Almost, though, also like there was a class segregation. Like you had, not everyone up the top was a huge moneymaker or whatever, but most of them were established. And then you had all these underground people who would basically inherit making very little money. Which, again, bonus episode, you'll hear about that. And that's mainly why I'm wearing this T-shirt, by the way. I mean, it's really no surprise to think so much of what we talk about when it comes to music history has to do with economics. And I'm going to get into that pretty intently, as I did in last week's bonus MXtra video on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. I'm going to get quite into it in this week's bonus MXtra video as well. And I'm going to mention it in this regular episode, too. But anyway, some debuts. I don't have that many listed. Jamila Woods, Japanese Breakfast, one of my favorites. Evanescence debuted in 2016. Kane Brown, Brothers Osborne, Charlie Puth, Post Malone, JPEG Mafia, such an interesting artist, and Kygo in 2016. Some other notable releases, The Monkees. Adam Schlesinger helmed that thing, the guy from Fountains of Wayne. What a great album. Great, sign-off, I guess, so in a way, from the Monkees, because 3 of them were still alive at the time. Radiohead had a great album that year, as did Parquet Court, so I've mentioned before. Bon Iver, Leonard Cohen's final. I think it released posthumously? Can't remember. Drive-By Truckers, Sturgill Simpson, Mitski, great album. Sia, Esperanza Spalding, Maxwell, kind of a comebacky thing. Chance the Rapper, Death Grips. Look them up. They're weird and they're worth listening to. Danny Brown, Young Thug, Anderson .Paak. Oh, I respect him so much. Apparently, the Rolling Stones had a notable album that year, as did Elton John and Sting and Iggy Pop. So some oldie dudes happening in 2016. 2017, a real transitional year. And why do I say that? surges from past trends and stars existed along with new stars staking their claim. And to me, it was an even more interesting year musically than 2016, although you'll come to find that it's not even my favorite year in the latter half of the 2010s, but still very interesting. And I think it's partly because new music was making more of an impact. That thing I was saying in the previous year about how there was this divide. The divide started to, cross over a little bit more. But also in I believe 2017, speaking of crossover, was also the year that digital sales surpassed CDs for the first time. Pretty sure it was 2017. The deaths in 2017 were pretty significant as well. Tom Petty, Chris Cornell, Chester Bennington, Prodigy, the rapper Prodigy, not the guy from the Prodigy who would die later on. Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Walter Becker from what's it called? The dudes that everybody loved in college. Steely Dan. Glenn Campbell died in 2017, as did Al Jarreau. So it's kind of like, in a sense, this crossover year 2017, like the old world was giving way to the emerging new one between 2016 and 2017. Top albums for the year: 50 Shades Darker, Soundtrack. Ed Sheeran, Sam Smith, Niall Horan has had a debut. Harry Styles' debut. Both went to number one. Halsey, Lorde, Lana Del Rey, Kesha, Katy Perry, Pink, Taylor Swift, Shania Twain, all number one albums. Kenny Chesney, Luke Bryan, Thomas Rhett, brand new. Arcade Fire, The Killers had a number one. I forgot that they had one in 2017. U2's Songs of Experience, which was their last album of all new music so far, went to number one. Foo Fighters, another number one. They keep going. Linkin Park. I think that was the last Chester Bennington, of course, album. LCD Sound System, who's back. The Chainsmokers' debut, which the song "I Want Something Just Like This." Dun, 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 dun. I don't know. I did an acoustic cover of that a few years ago. The Weeknd, Pentatonix, Bryson Tiller, Logic, NF, Big Sean, Migos, Future had two albums at number one. Lil Uzi Vert's debut went to number one. DJ Khaled had another number one. So did Jay-Z and Drake. But the big winner for the year was Kendrick Lamar with Damn, Pulitzer winner. Great album. I mentioned talking about Kendrick, how I liked previous albums more, but man, even the new one that kind of got overlooked, I loved that one too. It's one of my favorite artists in general. Debuts for 2017, only in the mid-200s, but not the lowest it would go. A whole lot more South Korean and Latinx and tons of indie-ish hip-hop, such as Vic Mensa, A Boogie with the Hoodie, Lil Yachty. And you had 21 Savage and Playboi Carti. Brockhampton debuted. Such an interesting freaking collective. They released 3 albums in 2017, Saturation 1, 2, and 3. SZA, Dua Lipa, Extentation, Idols, amazing punk band from the UK. Alex Leahy, Phoebe Bridgers, 2017. Rosalia, I think. Luke Combs, all debut albums in 2017. Some other notable releases: Khalid, not DJ Khaled. King Krul, interesting dude. Tyler, the Creator, also so interesting. Vince Staples, St. Vincent. Waxahachie, Low Cut Connie, Always, were going strong in the 2010s, as was Paramore. Queens of the Stone Age, who I always associate with the 2000s, still putting out great stuff. Grizzly Bear, Beck's Colors. Beck had a real, I won't say comeback because it didn't happen in the charts in other ways, and I even overlooked Beck in the 2010s, but in the late 2010s, Beck released some amazing stuff, as did Japanese Breakfast. Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, posthumously released after Sharon Jones died. Jason Isbell, Margot Price, and Chris Stapleton all had some great albums in 2017. And this is where the break happens in this episode. Stick around after the mid-roll. We're going to get into 2018 and the conclusions and featured song and all that stuff. See you soon. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdimatteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you'd really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. Mini Crossfade, and we're back. Thank you for checking out that mid-roll if you did, and if you didn't, go straight to hell. Can't believe you would. No, I tend to skip commercials too, although if you did skip it, the basic essence of it was go to nickdimatteo.com, which now I'm putting like texty things on the screen there if you're watching, so it's a little bit easier to find this stuff. And also note, I do my best to try to divide these pretty evenly in the midpoint. I don't rehearse these. I write them and I freaking go for it. These are one take dealios, all of these episodes. So sometimes I would say episodes are bottom heavy, meaning the second half's longer than the first, which is sort of a no-no in the world of entertainment. Like if you're doing a 2-act play, you kind of want to make the second act shorter. Doesn't always mean that's the case or that's good, but I do my best. So a little programming note there. Getting into 2018, continuing the fracturing trend. Again, mostly to great effect up and down the charts. While some of us might miss the age of consensus in music, and in part I do, although the consensus we think was there wasn't really there the way we remember it, but still, you know what I'm getting at. The breadth of options that music has given us in the last 15 years is stunning. And 2018 was super strong. It had that breadth of options. Lots of throwback music in dance. Lots of throwback in rock. We had shoegaze and punk and post-punk and emo coming back in 2018. A lot of it bubbling up. Not really hitting the charts very much. Some of it did. Big showing for emo rap, which was something I talked about in my emo episode. Emo hip-hop, emo rap. Huge thing in the late 2010s and beyond. And a huge debuts from female hip-hop artists, really coming to the fore in ways that they hadn't fully done previous decades. Much, much, much more international, including, of course, South Korea and Africa. I mean, again, just so many from those two regions in particular. Also, a lot of, Latin countries. I don't know why I said it that way. Also, troublingly, and this, started the previous year in 2017. I mentioned some of those artists. Quite a few young artists were making splashes first or second time who are now already dead, who were in their 20s. Other trends that would take over in the 2020s, such as alt country or country by African-American artists, rock music resurging again, trans performers, started to really trickle in 2018, if not a little before. Top albums. Each of the last few years, there have been more and more top charting albums. I mean, a little dip here. I mentioned the year in the last week's episode that had 44. This time it's 41, so almost the most. Crazy. So number one album is Andrea Bocelli, The Greatest Showman soundtrack, A Star is Born soundtrack, Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper, Black Panther soundtrack, mostly Kendrick Lamar, Drake had a number one album. Eminem had 2 number one albums. Kanye, again, Lil Wayne, Meek Mill. Man, what a roll. Travis Scott, Logic, J. Cole, Post Malone. Lots of people on a roll. Cardi B's debut went to number one. Kodak Black, Metro Boomin's debut. Don't know much about them. Migos, again at a number one. Brockhampton, again at a number one. I gotta say, I've only heard a couple of their albums, but I devoured them. They're so freaking interesting. XXXTentacion, had a number one album. XXXTentacion is dead. BTS, number one album. There you go. Start of their dominance. The Weeknd, Justin Timberlake, Ariana Grande, Camila Cabello's debut went to number one. Shawn Mendes, Jack White, Paul McCartney's Egypt Station in 2018. So I got the date of that wrong. None to number one. Bon Jovi, Fall Out Boy, again number one. Wow. I associate Fall Out Boy with the 2000s. I didn't know they had so many number ones in the 2010s. Just like I didn't know that Dave Matthews kept making number one albums throughout the 2000s and 2010s, including this year. I think it shows album dominance is not the determinant of what music is popular anymore, if it ever was, especially on streaming. The fact that the Dave Matthews Band could have so many number one albums in the 2000s and 2010s and yet have, to me, not zero presence, but zero cultural presence on streaming and everything shows the divide there. But again, a number one album in 2018, as well as Panic at the Disco, 5 Seconds of Summer, Mumford & Sons. Jason Aldean, Carrie Underwood, but the top of the year, competing with Post Malone neck and neck, was Taylor Swift's album in 2018. Interesting debuts, still in the mid-200s, but listen to me. Just a few years ago, we were talking about 450 debuts, and now we're happy that they're in the mid-200s, and they wouldn't stay there. In 2018, Morgan Wallen, Ashley McBryde, Greta Van Fleet, all debuted. Soccer Mommy, love that artist. Blackpink, Doja Cat, No Name, Tierra Whack. I love saying whack. 6ix9ine, Benny the Butcher, Lil Baby. Juice WRLD debuted in 2018 and is now dead. Nipsey Hussle debuted in 2018 and is now dead. But the biggest debut here is probably Bad Bunny, I would say, by a long shot. Although Morgan Wallen probably gives him a run for his money as far as artists who are huge now. Notable releases in 2018, other than what I've mentioned already, Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer, maybe her best album, although I really need to listen to her new one. J Balvin, Esperanza Spalding, Pusha T, JPEG Mafia, again, interesting artist. Mac Miller, Robin, Mitski's on a roll that still hasn't stopped. Florence and the Machine, Father John Misty, who had a good run in the 2010s. So not that he's not doing anything now, by the way, not his real name. Casey Musgraves, Courtney Barnett, Brandy Carlisle. That album had The Joke. I mentioned that before. It sounds like an old song of mine from the early mid-90s. The same chord progression, certain other things. She did it in 2018. Love the song. John Prine and David Byrne's American Utopia, all 2018, which brings me to the final year of this 2-week, 2-part 2010s. What's an album and why? 2019, interesting year. Bunch of old school acts returned to the charts. And I think that happened for two reasons. Number one, kind of like in 2012, people needed some old school. I don't know why this happens every few years, but it happened. And number two, once again, like with the Dave Matthews Band, the charts don't necessarily reflect anymore what people are actually streaming or listening to. Interesting. Yeah, lots of hip-hop and pop. Rock is there, but not much. Country, also not there much. Top. Now, that would change. It's going to change, and maybe in the final episode of this series, I'll talk about that. But at this point, we were really hitting that downward slide, especially in the rock world. Top albums of the year. Tool's first album in 13 years went to number one, as did Slipknot, Vampire Weekend. The Raconteurs' third album, didn't even know they did that. Harry Styles went to number one. Edge, that's a great album, by the way, as was his next one. Ed Sheeran again, Hozier. Luke Combs again, Thomas Rhett again. The Stars Born soundtrack, A Holdover. The Frozen 2 soundtrack went to number one. Revenge of the Dreamers 3 compilation hip-hop album went to number one. 21 Savage, A Boogie with the Hoodie, Future, so a lot of similar. Juice WRLD, as mentioned, dead not too long after that. Nav, Logic, Tyler the Creator, Drake, Kanye, so a lot of the same names. Young Thug, DaBaby. His second album went to number one in 2019, but he also released his first album in 2019, the debut. Young Boy Never Broke Again, number one. Trippie Reed, Roddy Ricch's debut. NF again at number one, so is Post Malone. Chris Brown, Khalid again. Jonas Brothers, first album in 10 years went to number one. Backstreet Boys come back, number one. BTS again. Super M, Also a South Korean band, went to number 1. Celine Dion, number 1. Ariana Grande, Pink, and Madonna all went to number 1. But the big winner of 2019, Billie Eilish's debut album, When We Dream or Wake Up or whatever it is. I don't know. That's when she started her dominance. Debuts of 2019 in the low 200s. Not nearly as low as it would get, but pretty damn low. So much lower in the beginning of the decade. There's a clear difference between the beginning and end of this decade. Rock, again, was sundowning. Not the first time, not the last time. Just had that talk with my parents about how people were saying rock was dead when Elvis went into the army. And they said it was dead again in probably some point in the 60s. And then, or well, at least in the 70s, they certainly said rock was dead. And they, over and over. Sure. No genre has ever really died. Let's just say that. So Nerd, no one ever really dies. Remember that band? Pharrell's band. Pop and hip hop surging again. New forms like hyperpop emerging by the end of the 2010s. Yet at this point, we're already starting to see really interesting rock and solo, like singer-songwriter type artists, as more or less throwbacks bubbling under. And they'd come to do more in this decade. Meaning brand new acts, not although it seems by this year that there were, again, a lot of throwbacks too. Labels were almost aggressively favoring non-USA acts by the end of the 2010s. What all this was doing was further blurring genre lines, which is where we still are. And so I say all that in the debuts section. Some great debuts. Again, DaBaby, 2 albums in 2019. Young Gravy, kind of Chance the Rapper debuted, although he'd been releasing mixtapes since 2012. And we're going to talk a little about the mixtape thing in conclusions. Kind of Megan Thee Stallion, though she'd been releasing mixtapes since 2016. But these are major label debuts. Becky G, Hannah Diamond, Sudan Archives. Well, what a great sound they have. Ari Lennox, Summer Walker, Black Pumas, Black Midi, 100 Gex. It's the hyper pop. Emil and the Sniffers, putting out a new album this year, very soon actually. Fontaines DC, Nilüfer Yanya. Somebody look up Nilüfer Yanya. Good music. Clairo, Carolyn Polachek, Maggie Rogers, Orville Peck, the South African dude who does kind of alt country with some shoegaze and goth and things mixed in. Zach Bryan, Louis Capaldi, and Ben Platt, all debuted in 2019. Some other notable releases in 2019, Brockhampton, again. What a strong run, and I think their run is continuing. I don't know. JPEG Mafia, again. Lil Sims, FKA Twigs. You say it how you want to say it. Solange had a great album in 2019, as did Ways Blood, Tom York, Lana Del Rey. Norman fucking Rockwell came out in 2019. Sharon Van Etten, Sleater Kinney, who apparently are getting even better now, and they were great then. Mannequin Pussy from Philly had a great album in 2019. Nick Cave, by the way, mentioned on a lot of like end of year best albums in the entire 2010s, so I had to make sure to put him in at least once. Kim Gordon's first solo album, which I mentioned in light of this year's release, did half an episode on that with Steve Erickson. Slow Tie, basically punk hip hop. Burna Boy, again, had a good album. The Highwomen, worth mentioning because Brandi Carlile, Amanda Shires, Natalie Hemby, and Maren Morris, that's their band. Brittany Howard's first solo, and she's still going super strong. Lizzo had a great album in 2019, as did Beck again with Hyperspace. And that strong run that I think is going to continue when he puts out his new album very soon. And in the words of Coldplay or Chris Martin, the album they put out in 2019 was the beginning of their fuck it era. Like, we're just going to do, we've already hit the heights. What else did they need to do for 20 years at that point? Just do whatever they want. Great place to be in any career. Which brings me to the conclusions. So, as we know, and I mentioned, by the end of the 2019s and slightly before, digital sales finally killed physical, or at least demanded it to submit to a much lesser status. At the beginning of the decade, CDs had just under 50% of the market share, not anywhere near their 95% market share when they were at their height, but 50%, still pretty solid in the 2010. Downloads, 32% of the market share, And all other digital, including streaming, only about 16% of the market share. So CDs, no matter how you cut those numbers, CDs were still dominant in the beginning of the 2010s. But by the end of the decade, vinyl and CDs both each had 5% of the market share. And by 2019, streaming at 80% of the market share, and was almost non-existent in 2010. It's not the highest streaming would go. That's come in the last couple of years. It hasn't gone much higher. Other digital formats, about 10% of the market share. So total between streaming and other digital, 90% of the market share. And CDs 5 and vinyl 5. What a huge switch in the decade. That's really the transitional decade. You really have to say that. This is my note on what I mentioned about Kobas and about, loving the physical aspect of music. Albums in particular have always relied on packaging to present a cohesive artistic statement. If you go back to my very first episode in this series, what I talked about was that the name for music album came from albums like photo albums and other collections that would be in, books or binders, whatever, however they did it back then, but a collection of things. And how they were packaged was super, super important, which means the visual aspect of music is far more important than we give credit to. I talked about that a little bit in my, do music videos really matter? And how the visual can affect how you consume, how you absorb, how you interpret music. That's obviously true for videos. Stories that are told in videos may not be what you thought you heard from the lyrics if you didn't see the video. But it's more true than we realize just for the packaging. I remember driving with CDs, cassettes, whatever you want to do, and certainly pre-driving with vinyl, looking at the lyrics and liner notes and other things and just the artwork, or even, when Pearl Jam would put out freaking booklets of photos and things like that. And when I would create an album, even post-physical, for a while, I would say, well, this song had this visual representation, et cetera, et cetera. It's something I still like to do now and then. I haven't done it as much. But what I will say about all that is, and this may be true for you too, I remember the music from physical albums more than I do from digital ones for the most part. There are certain albums I've heard in the last 10 to 15 years that will never leave me, because there's still great music being made all the time. But as far as it getting into your soul, there's something about, first of all, spending money on something and then having it in your hand and then knowing that, well, I'm going to get my money's worth. I'm going to listen to this 2, 3, 4 times. It just sticks with you in a way that perhaps non-physical doesn't. And all that started to all but disappear by the end of the 2010s, which means the definition of what an album was started to change as well. It was the era where albums were beginning to be more deconstructed, and artists had to rethink what an album is, what it even meant, which was also influenced, and I said I'd get to this again, by mixtape releases, which had been around for at least 15 years. But the mixtape was basically a way of saying, in most, I believe in almost every case, they're self-releases, releases that labels couldn't or didn't want to release, and artists to do it themselves, either prior to them being famous or even afterwards. The best thing to me about the rise of mixtapes is, again, how much music has really been put in the hands of artists since the SoundCloud, the internet era, etc., which questions, and this is interesting, every single one of my debut albums lists from the freaking first episode of this series till now and beyond is put into question, because I'm getting the list from a source, Wikipedia, that is getting it from labels, which means I guarantee you that even though it might be like the number of releases at the beginning of the 2010s was in the 400s, and by the end of the 2010s was in the low 200s, that doesn't mean that less music was being released. In fact, I bet you far more music was being released at the end of the decade than the beginning. It's just that most of it was wildly independent, to the point where it would be hard to even know where to find it, which is a problem we all have as artists. right? And perfect example, speaking of my band Rec, when would you clock Rec's debut album, right? So we put out our first album in 2007. I mentioned that 2 episodes ago in this series. And yet have not had a major label release. Now, does that mean I'm shopping this new album to a label, the new album Kite to Camden, to a label or two? If that gets released by the label or a label, is someone out there going to call that Rec's debut after existing all this time? I don't know. That's why I'm saying it calls into question. But it doesn't mean that things like mixtapes and self-releases are, it actually means that they're pretty damn awesome, and we need to find more of them. But the worst thing about mixtapes is it shows the decline of the industry in general and labels' willingness to spend money on unproven talent. They just almost never do it anymore. Little ones do it to a degree, which is, I'm not knocking. They're amazing if they do. But most labels, they don't. What it means is how many followers and streams you already have, which is a catch-22, because when you don't have label or money for promotion, backing of any kind, then you're supposed to push your numbers up online so that you then can get the label and the money and the backing. I mean, I don't know. Don't be fooled by the overcorrective positivity of being able to record and release your own music. A lot of, as much as I firmly believe that power should be in the hands of the people, et cetera, when you push that too far, you're basically a small government mindset, meaning the aids that we need, often many of us need, almost all of us need at some point in our lives, diminish to the point where we can't get the help we need, whether that's from private industry, whether that's from government, whether it's within the music world or out of the music world. So while I think self-determination is super important, we are still a society and a collective. And in my bonus MXtra video, I'm going to talk about ways in which hopefully we can figure out how to correct it back in the other direction so that we have more support as artists, as people. Some artists in the 2010s were still crafting cohesive statements, including mixtapes. But most, especially newer artists, were simply collecting their current recordings, singles, calling it an album, not unlike the 1950s and most of the 1960s, so not the first time. That trend would start to shift in 2020s. You'll find out later in this series. But it's important to note now that some artists in all genres were still giving consideration to telling a story with an album, even in the 2010s, which was pretty much one of the lowest points for albums. Think of Tyler, the Creator's number 19 album, Igor, which was a concept album. So it's still out there in every genre. It's still an open question as to, does the general music fan still take time to listen to albums all the way through? And if so, do they do it more than once? Or do they just hit up singles or create playlists and listen to all the songs out of context? I'm going to explore that a little bit more in the last episode of this series. Tracking for the sales and stuff, it's both easier and harder. It's easier because internet, and I've said because internet a few times in the last 2 episodes, but it's harder because I'm not sure any person or any algorithm or any organization is actually tracking discrete listening habits to that degree. There have been so many things that I've wanted to put in episodes that I couldn't find the information for. And when you're thinking everything's online, it's not true. There's so many things that you can't find online. Now, I think with the proper staff and research money, patreon.com/music is not a genre, we could create that research and put it online and answer some of these questions. But I couldn't find it. Note, by the way, on how people consume music, while the percentages of sales show how people prefer to listen to music, they don't tell the tale that in the 2010s saw overall sales numbers drop far below their early 2000s peak, 2014 being the low point, and they still haven't come close to recovering. Even though the industry in general is said to have recovered to a degree, it's sort of like saying the economy has recovered. Sure, to a degree, but it's nowhere near the health that it was in past decades. More people were and are listening to music for free, which I do it too sometimes, which makes it even harder to know how albums themselves are being appreciated or not. Which, of course, leads to my bonus MxG video on patreon.com/musicisnotgenre, how fans, businesses, and artists can reconcile this whole problem, which is a larger question of economics in general, and is the conclusion of last week's bonus MxG video. Go to Patreon and check it out. Brings me to the featured song. Rec released an album, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, in 2015 called The Sunshine Seminar. I've shared many songs. Go to that featured songs playlist on youtube.com/@musicisnotgenre, and you can hear, I think there's over 70 now. Maybe more than that even. The song I am sharing this week, and you'll hear in a minute or two, is called Me, You, and Everyone. It is reverb-laden dream pop. It's shoegaze. It's glitch rock. And it goes down well live. I'm going to put it in the set next year at some point. The lyrics, it's a war between desire and despair, trying to hold on to hope when you have nothing left. And basically saying that if we're all dying, then why not just risk everything and trampoline into the sun? That's one of the lyrics, one of my favorites. I had an idea for this of a music video of a cult asking its followers to jump on a trampoline as they're dying of poison or who knows what, or jumping into a fire. I don't know. But just sort of doing this double meaning of what the lyrics were all about. Anybody out there want to shoot a music video, hit me up. I've got a lot of songs. I've done a bunch of videos you can find on Rec's YouTube page, channel, whatever. But I'd like to do a ton more. And I'd like to work with you, whoever you are. Questions for this episode. What were your favorite albums of the second half of the 2010s? Were you still listening to full albums at that point? Were you doing anything physical at that point? Or was it all by the mid to late 2010s streaming? I'd love to know your answers to all these questions because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging. One more episode to go in the album series. I don't know when it'll be, but I know I will talk to you next week.
Not an observer, you're always in. When you make that jump, you can't choose how you fall. 'Cause when you give it up, you give it all. So if you need to break and run, trampoline. Desire with despair, trying to burn bright, but running on air. When you feel that rush, it's not the thing you know. It's only that you've lost, so just let go.